Welcome to Blender. This tutorial will introduce you to the basics of Blender's interface and creating basic objects. By the end of this video, you'll feel comfortable navigating the workspace and ready to start creating. The interface overview. The Blender interface can be a bit overwhelming. Blender is powerful and complex software, but with practice and dedication you will learn what does what and why. The interface can be divided up into three main parts. The top bar. The top bar has drop-down menus for functions such as saving and loading files, setting preferences, opening windows, etc. It is good to familiarize yourself with these menus. There are also tabs for quickly switching between workspaces. Different workspaces for different jobs. We will explore these as we learn Blender. The editors. The space in the middle is divided up into rectangles called areas and is reserved for editors. An editor in Blender can be a 3D viewport in which we modify vertices, edges, and surfaces to model our shape, or a UV editor where we lay out our textures to fit onto our models. There are 23 different default editors in Blender, and it will take time and dedication to master them. The status bar. Across the bottom of the screen is the status bar. This interface element provides context-sensitive information concerning the tool or object selected. When in doubt, look at the status bar. The default editors. Now we will focus on the default editors available when we open Blender. Dominating the work area is the 3D viewport. The 3D viewport editor. The 3D viewport provides a window into our 3D world. It is here that we will spend much of our time in Blender. It allows us to create, place, and manipulate objects such as geometry in the 3D space that is our scene. There are many concepts, tools, and methods used in the 3D viewport. Across the top are drop-down menus for various functions specific to this editor. If you hover over each of the buttons, Blender will display the name of the button and basic instructions on how to use it. This is super useful. I am going to give you an overview of the buttons and encourage you to explore the manual to learn more. The first icon on the left allows us to select what editor we want to use. This is the only button most editors will have in common. Each editor will have its own buttons across the top. Next, we can choose a mode for the 3D viewport editor. We will learn more about this soon. Directly below is a status bar that updates with information concerning the view. Next to the mode selector we have various drop-downs specific to the editor. In the middle are the transform orientations, snapping, and proportional editing controls. On the top right are various display controls. Toggles for functions like wireframe mode. How and what gizmos will be displayed in the viewport and more. As we journey through Blender, we will explore these options. The 3D world is divided into three axes X, Y, and Z. They are represented by red X, green Y, and blue Z. The X-axis runs from left to right with the values increasing as one moves to the right. The Y-axis runs forward and backward with the values increasing as one moves away. The Z-axis runs up and down with the values increasing as one moves up. The point where the three axes meet is called world origin and has the designation of 0, 0, 0. It is the center of our 3D world. The gizmo below the display options shows the direction of view. Clicking the X, Y, Z circles will change the view to an orthographic front, right, or top view. Clicking the blank circle will take you to the opposite view. For example, the empty green circle will take you to a rear view. Clicking and dragging will allow you to orbit the view. Take note that the text on the left side of the viewport changes to reflect the changes in the view. Next, we see icons for zooming, panning, camera view, toggling between orthographic and perspective view. Pressing the N key will open the sidebar on the right side of the viewport. This sidebar provides information concerning the scene such as an object's position in 3D space, the scale or rotation of an object and more. Pressing T will open the toolbar on the left side of the viewport. In the beginning it is good practice to write shortcut keys and other concepts in your notes and review them often till you have memorized them. Moving to the top right we have the outliner editor. The outliner editor. To the top right of the 3D viewport area is the outliner. The outliner is a hierarchical view of everything in the scene. The scene is broken down into collections that are similar to layers. The Properties Editor. The Properties Editor provides access to different properties of objects and the world in general through the tabs running down the left of the area. We will learn and explore these tabs as we use them. For now, begin to familiarize yourself by hovering over each of them and reading the name before clicking on the tab to switch to it. Knowing the name is always the first step. The tabs are arranged in a logical fashion. The Timeline Editor. Across the bottom of the screen below the 3D viewport is the Timeline Editor. The timeline allows for the creation and editing of keyframes involved in animation. A note about areas and editors. In Blender, the interface is fluid and can be customized to be what you want. Clicking through the workspaces, layout, sculpting, UV editing, shows the variety available. Any area can be any editor of your choosing. Simply select the type of editor from the first icon on the top left. To resize a window, hover between two windows till the cursor changes to a double-headed arrow, then left-click and drag. It is possible to split, join, or swap areas. Hover between two areas till the cursor changes to a double-headed arrow, and right-click to bring up the Area Options pop-up. Choose the option you want and follow the arrows. For now, let us join the Timeline Editor to the 3D Viewport Editor. Do the following. Hover between the two areas till the double-headed arrow appears. Right-click to access the area options. Select Join Areas, point the arrow down towards the timeline. Left-click to confirm. The 3D viewport now extends to the status bar at the bottom of the interface. If you wish to reset the layout to factory settings, click File Defaults, Load Factory Settings. The Interface Overview Summary. In this section we discussed Blender's default layout and learned how it is arranged into three principal sections. We discussed workspaces and how they have different arrangements for the editors for specific tasks in Blender. We discussed the 3D viewport and began learning some of the basic tools there. We learned that the 3D world is made up of three axes, X, Y, Z. The world origin is where the three axes meet at 0, 0, 0. We discussed the shortcut keys N and T. We discussed areas and editors, how to resize them, how to change the type of editor and more. Now is the time to have Blender open. Practice orbiting using the gizmo. Use the gizmo to jump to a front or side view by clicking on the XYZ circle. Zoom or pan the view using the icons. We will learn shortcuts for this in the next section. Select an object by left-clicking it in the outliner or 3D viewport. Explore the properties for that object using the Properties Editor. Practice resizing, splitting, merging, and swapping areas. Reset your settings to default. In the next section we will explore the 3D viewports and how we can orbit, pan, and zoom using shortcut key and mouse combos to see our model from every direction. We will learn the tools and methods to select, move, scale, and rotate objects. We will explore a tool that allows us to take notes right in the editor and more. Viewport Navigation and Object Manipulation Overview. Effectively selecting and modifying objects and controlling the view in the 3D viewport is a major factor to being successful in Blender. In this section we will discuss diverse ways to control the view of our scene, and a few basic operations we can perform on objects like moving and rotating. Perspective versus orthographic. In the 3D viewport, Blender will either use perspective or orthographic view. In the upper left-hand corner, we can see the current view. A perspective view is a 3D view of the world with perspective applied. An orthographic view is a 2D view of the world without perspective applied. Use the gizmo in the top right corner to change the view by clicking and dragging in the white area or click and release one of the marked axes, X, Y, Z. Take note of the text changing in the top left corner. Both views have their uses as we will discover. Keyboard shortcuts for controlling the view. In the last section we explored using the gizmo to change the viewport view. The gizmo is handy, but it is impractical to return to it every time we wish to adjust the view. Instead, Blender provides keyboard shortcuts for every function. Some of these keys will differ between editors, some will be the same. To control the view in the 3D viewport we will use a combination of the mouse and keyboard. Here are the basics. Middle mouse button equals orbit the view. Middle mouse button plus shift equals pan the view. Middle mouse will scroll equals zoom the view. The numpad will perform many operations with the view. 1 equals front orthographic. 3 equals right orthographic. 7 equals top orthographic. Period equals zoom to selected. And much more. Selecting objects. At its simplest, selecting an object is as simple as left-clicking the object. Practice this by clicking on the default cube, the light, or the camera in the 3D viewport. In the 3D viewport, press T to open the Tools panel on the left side. The top tool is the Select tool. By clicking and holding the Select tool, the flyout will open and you can change the selection mode. This works for many tools. Look for the little arrow in the bottom right corner of the tool. Repeatedly pressing the W key while in the 3D viewport will cycle through the different selection modes. Return to the box selection mode when you have finished. Next is the 3D cursor, used as the insertion point for new objects and more. Using the box selection, left-click on the default cube to select it. The selected cube will highlight orange. Move, rotate, scale. Moving, scaling, and rotating objects in the 3D viewport is an essential skill. Below the 3D cursor are the move, rotate, and scale tools. The tools are used to position, rotate, and scale objects in 3D space. Tool gizmos. With the cube selected, click the Move tool directly below the 3D cursor icon. The Move gizmo appears at the origin point of the selected object. 3 arrows pointing in color-coded for the axis they represent. Clicking the next 2 icons will select the Rotate and Scale tools, which have different but similar gizmos. Below the 3 separate tool icons in the toolbar is the Transform tool, which displays all 3 gizmos at the same time. The origin point of an object is represented by the orange dot visible when the object is selected. The object will scale and rotate around this point in space. It is how we determine the position of the object. Although different, the gizmos mostly behave in an equivalent manner. Clicking in the white area on the gizmo will affect all 3 axes, X, Y, Z at the same time. Clicking on a color-coded axis will constrain the transforms to that axis, red for X, green for Y, blue for Z. With the Move tool selected, clicking on the colored square will move the object on the 2 selected axes. Below the Transform tools there are 3 more icons. The Annotate tool, that lets you write notes in the editor. The Measuring tool, that lets you measure distance in the viewport. The Add tool lets you create primitive 3D objects by clicking and dragging in the viewport. We will explore creating objects soon. Shortcuts for transforming objects. A quicker way to select and transform an object is with shortcut keys. Key combinations that let us select a tool and quickly lock the axis of transform in a few keystrokes. The 3 transforms Move, Scale, and Rotate can be accessed using G equals Move, S equals Scale, R equals Rotate. Click on an object to select it. Press G to grab and move the selected object in the 3D viewport. Pressing G will let us move the object on all 3 axes at once. Like clicking in the white square in the gizmo. After selecting the transform you wish to perform, choose the axis you wish to constrain to by pressing X, Y, or Z. If you press the wrong one, no worries, just press the correct one and Blender will constrain to that axis. Perform the transform with the mouse. Left-click to confirm, right-click to cancel. Try Shift plus X, Y, Z, doing so will exclude the chosen axis and allow transform on the other 2 axes. Another useful shortcut to remember is A to select all. Pressing AA rapidly will deselect all. Viewport navigation and object manipulation summary. In this section we discussed different methods to select objects. While we focused on the 3D viewport, the selection modes discussed work in most every editor. We discussed transforming objects in the viewport. We discussed tool gizmos and their operation. We discussed shortcuts for selecting and transforming objects and constraining those transforms to certain axes. We discussed the annotation tool that allows us to write notes to ourselves or others inside the editor. The information contained in this section is fundamental and is part of the foundation for everything that follows in this class. Mastering simple things like selecting and transforming objects will be the foundation of using Blender. Give it the proper attention and time it deserves. In the next section we will explore how to add primitive 3D objects, the three elements they are constructed of, and how we can edit those elements to begin creating assets. Practice what you have learned selecting and transforming objects in the 3D viewport and changing your view. Do this using both the gizmos and the shortcuts discussed until it starts to become second nature. The more you do an action, the less you will need to think about that action. This is called muscle memory and is an essential element to mastering new software. Creating and editing objects. In Blender we can create and manipulate various objects. For this section we will focus on creating primitive meshes. Mesh. Meshes are basic shapes that we can use to start modeling our assets. These include objects such as cubes, spheres, planes, and many more. These are commonly referred to as primitives. There are several ways to create new objects in Blender. Located at the bottom of the toolbar on the left side of the 3D viewport there is the Add button. This tool allows you to click and drag in the viewport to create a primitive. Click and hold the button to select the primitive you want to create, then click and drag in the viewport to draw the primitive. Note you can only add primitive mesh objects from this menu. The Add drop-down menu located at the top of the 3D viewport provides access to more types of objects divided into logical categories. Click the Add button, then navigate to the type of object you want to create and select it. The selected object will be created in the 3D viewport where the 3D cursor, the red and white circle, is. The third way is to use the shortcut key Shift+A. Doing so will open the Add menu where the mouse cursor is, allowing you to quickly choose the object you want to add. The selected object will appear in the 3D viewport where the 3D cursor is positioned. This is my preferred method to create new objects in Blender. 3D cursor. The 3D cursor, the red and white circle, in the 3D viewport is an important tool. It acts as the insertion point for objects created using method 2 or 3. It can be used to precisely position objects in 3D space or used as the pivot point for objects and more. For now, we will focus on using it as the insertion point. Here are 2 ways to reposition the 3D cursor. Select the 3D cursor from the toolbar on the left and left-click anywhere in the 3D viewport. All objects created now will appear in the new 3D cursor position. The shortcut key Shift plus right-click will position the 3D cursor at the position of the mouse click. To return the 3D cursor to world origin, press Shift plus S to open the snap menu and select Cursor to World Origin. Editing mesh objects. When working with mesh objects there are 2 separate modes in which we can edit the object. These are Object and Edit mode. The toggle to change the mode is in the top left corner of the 3D viewport. The Tab key can be used to quickly switch between modes. Object mode allows us to modify parameters like position, scale, rotation, and more. Editing in object mode affects the entire object. When we tab into Edit mode, we are editing the elements that make up the primitive object. There are 3 elements that we are concerned with. They are vertices, edges, and faces. A vertex is a point in space. An edge is a straight line that connects 2 vertices. A face is any set of enclosed edges. It is by manipulating these elements using the tools in Edit mode that we will create our models. Creating and editing objects summary. In this section we discuss 3 different ways to create objects in the 3D viewport. We learned how to move and return the 3D cursor, and that it acts as the insertion point for objects. We learned how to switch between Object and Edit mode for mesh objects. Object mode affects the whole object and Edit mode allows us to edit the elements that make up the mesh. These are vertices, a point in space. Edges, 2 connected vertices make an edge, a closed set of edges is called a face. Summary. Blender is a complex and powerful piece of software that takes time and dedication to master. There is no substitute for spending time practicing in the program. In the next video we will create an original scene step by step to practice getting comfortable with the tools and concepts in Blender.